So I don't know if you heard that, but we're being recorded. I'm going to share the screen. And from memory, I go to here. We're assuming. And here we are. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. This is week 234, and I'm limited on what I can see now, fellas. I'm kind of blind. I've got one picture, like Arthur is up. Good morning, Arthur, up in the upper right-hand corner. So if you want to participate in the group and add a comment or a question or whatever, just speak up, because I can't see hands. It's got to be a verbal acknowledgement or question and a prompt, verbal prompt. That's the word. And then we can switch to you, because I can't see all of you on the screen. So all I see is my screen. We're in week 234 of John 18. If you lose me, well, no, we're not going to know that. We'll try it. I think, yeah, Arthur. I'm seeing a moving Arthur, so that means we're still connected. John 18, verse 10, and this morning is what I've entitled it as the mind goes, the blade goes. The mind, here's the idea. The state of my mind at any given time dictates, in this case, the blade, because that's going to be in the context of what we're going to be looking at. As the mind goes, the blade goes. So in reverse, I can understand where my mind is through my actions as illustrated through the blade. That's the idea. Last time we talked about the arrest, the ego eimi, the two uses of ego eimi. And what we came to as conclusion last time is the people around the person of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, they soon forget, just as we soon forget. We saw Jesus surrendering himself so that the others may go free. He is stepping forward into captivity so the others can walk away untouched. That's the point of the last couple weeks. And as Steve shared with us this morning, how deep the Father's love, that is really how I'm casting this entire narrative. Regardless of the reaction of the audience, or of the participants rather, the Father's love continues to reach out, or God's love through Christ. This is a vivid portrait of what God is like. The people have a other experience, and then they soon forget, and they're there to arrest Jesus. Even as they are arresting Jesus, he extends grace to them. And again, the relentless love of God in scope and patience. And then we talked about when life seems to be falling apart, what can we learn about God from the text? And that God is always present. How does Jesus' protective love speak to the fears right now? And so that's what we talked about. This morning, the text is Simon Peter in verse 10, Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, very graphic. He had a sword with him. He drew it, and he struck the high priest's slave, and he cut off his right ear. He had a sword, he drew it, and he struck the high priest, and he cut off his ear. The descriptors there super graphic. And the little additional phrase at the end, and the slave's name was Malchus. There's so much here. Overview. so here we are in our little overview, and I've been using this way of showing an overview as a kind of a sliding graphic across the screen. Peter brings a sword, that's assumed. Peter uses his sword very effectively. Man, he hit the mark. And then lastly, the third movement is the blade lands on the right ear of Malchus, slave of the high priest. So that's the overview. First of all, as we look at this text, is the idea that Peter brought his sword to the garden. And of course, there's questions about this, why? And I'll attempt here. From my perception, the reason Peter has a sword is that there was a common and shared belief among the general population of what the Messiah should be. And the Messiah should be a deliverer from the Roman machine, overarching their experience at the time. And 90% or more would cast this deliverance in the context of violent overflow. From what I've seen in The Chosen, they are casting that idea as a general belief. Even though Jesus was clear that his kingdom, in his words, he said, is not of this world, the bulk of the hearers, including Peter, filtered his words through their own ways of thinking. That's how they're casting the traitor Judas as well, in this whole movement. They've got it in their heads of what Jesus should be, and there's going to be quite a different story painted from this point on. Because of their filtering mechanisms, again, they're creating their own reality. And because of that, they're ignoring or reinterpreting Jesus's words to align with their own constructs of thought. It's how we humans operate. Now, some will say, now let's look at Luke 22:36. And some of you may be aware of this, some not, but 22:36 states this. Jesus said to them, by now let him who has a purse take it along, likewise also a bag, and let him who has no sword sell his robe and buy one. Okay, that's the text, and I should have put the comment first. Well, Luke 22:36, here's my comment on that. While Luke 22:36 has been used by some to advocate for aggression or self-defense, from my perspective, the entire Jesus story is clear that Jesus does not endorse violence as the means to gain control. Instead, the directive to buy a sword from Luke 22:6 should be understood as a metaphor in relation to the upcoming pushback rather than a literal call to arms. Fellas, I apologize, that's a very generalized statement, and I'm not going into the textual components of that statement. It's more the 20,000 or 30,000 foot view that to try to create the idea that Jesus is saying to the disciples, guys, you need a sword, and using that in an effective manner in relation to the kingdom advancement is really counter to the entire narrative of Jesus. So that's the approach. And from really the 30,000 foot perspective, and you can do with it, what you wish. Now, here is something that is true about swords. Peter and possibly the other disciples, we don't know, Peter brought a sword. He had a sword in the garden. And he brought his sword because, now this is my interpretation, according to Peter's thinking, his construct, even though he was a follower of Jesus, his sword was the means of protecting himself and Jesus. It was there to protect, and not for two people, himself and Jesus, and of course the mission. This is in line with what we read earlier within the text. All brought lanterns, torches, and weapons. And there are the arresters, and there are the disciples, and there is the all word. So they're coming there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Okay, so Peter's self-equipping represents the way we humans tend to think. I'm making a correlation. His actions demonstrate what well-meaning Christian people do to, now I'm looking at Peter as a follower of Jesus, so I'm making a correlation to generalized Christian followers, and here we have a clear example of how a well-meaning person, a follower of Jesus, what they do to themselves and other people. Peter knew his weapon, and he became quite good at hitting the mark. So I'm correlating this not to I'm looking at this at a very broad human a human condition we all share, regardless of our belief system. And to be quite frank, when motivated by anger, fear, or self-righteousness in the name of God, I too have become quite good at hitting my mark. And every time, fellas, I will testify that it's destructive. For me to lash out and use my sword in some manner, I can't say it's ever done any good. And I've done real good at it. You could just ask my dear wife Sandra. And I got really good at self-righteousness. I could be really good at that in quoting Bible verses, and did really destructive things on loved family members. So much a part of us. That's just what is true about a sword. A sword, when it's drawn, and when I use my sword to draw it and to use it, it leads to destruction. The recipient of Peter's act was Malchus, and we've now introduced him. And it's interesting that the name Malchus comes from the Hebrew word Malek, meaning king. And so we have a servant of the high priest, who is a slave or servant, who is named king, which I'm not going to push this too far, but I think it's interesting. So here we have a well-meaning follower of Jesus, Peter, using an act of aggression to severely wound an apparent enemy, Malchus, who's there to arrest Jesus, and his name is King. His name means king. There's so much irony here. And I think what the irony is centered around are two different perspectives. There's the frail human perspective, as exemplified through Peter. We have an enemy. We need to protect Jesus. I will use my sword. And we have Jesus' perspective, which is not stated in the text, fellas, but I'm taking liberty here. And this fella's name is King, means king. The demonstration is an act of destructive madness, initiated by a follower of Jesus towards a perceived enemy of Jesus. From Jesus's perspective, Malchus is no enemy. He's a human being whose name means king. Fellas, there is a deep propensity in all of us that we think we need, that it's the burden of responsibility is on you and me to protect Jesus. But the reality, fellas, Jesus needs no protection. He doesn't need our protection. He is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, creator of all things. He doesn't need you and I to protect. How one, now this is something worthy of meditation, and I would encourage you to think about it, all of us, me every day, and this is an everyday thing. How one thinks about God is how one treats other people. There's a direct correlation. The reverse is true. How one treats other people reflects how one thinks about God. So if I'm in conflict with people, it should be a commentary on how I'm thinking of God at that moment. And how I generally think about God is how I will treat other people. And that's a good thing to think about. So let's think about this. We're going to do an illustration. Arthur, you're still on the screen and moving, so that I'm assuming I'm connected. Can you give me a nod? Thank you. So here, thanks, Art. So here we have an illustration of John 18:10, the text and the graphic, and we have Peter using his sword very effectively and hitting its mark on Malchus's right ear. Fellas, I'm very aware that within the other text, I think it's Luke, Jesus heals the ear, but John chose to leave that out, and I want to talk about that. I believe Jesus healed the ear, but that's not John's focus here. It's what Peter did to a man named Malchus. Peter arrives with his sword. He has his sword for protection. That's pretty clear. He's there to protect. And that moves, what that's reflective of is a defensive stance. This is very much true within my upbringing as a Christian, within the context of where I was and how I was taught, that out there are enemies. And if you're in the group, if you're a Christian, if you're in the group, you're in. But a great amount of population is not in the group. Enemy may be a strong word, but it's graphic here. Peter viewed the disciples as the in-group, and Malchus was definitely part of the out-group. And so he was there to protect Jesus from Malchus. Thus, he had a defensive stance that was not in any way including others. It was there in suspect of others. And that is a protective, defensive posture. Now, it is that is the first step in my book of moving south. There's a I wouldn't even call it a fine line, but it is very slippery slope between being in a defensive posture and then using that posture to now attack. He actually attacks Malchus. There is no sword fight. Malchus is apparently not armed, but he cuts off his ear. And I think this is driven by when I assume the need to protect. When I'm taking this posture in my head, I've entered into the realm where it's a slippery slope, and I'm only one step away from attack. And fellas, we have seen this over and over again within our current culture, especially in the political, in the whole political arena. This is very apparent at this time. So attack always leads to destruction. I know that's been true in my life and possibly through your experience as well. So you got the need to protect, defensive posture, and that's a slippery introduction to, if I'm carrying a sword, I will probably use it. Peter arrives thinking he needs to protect. His defensiveness tumbles, there's the slippery slope, into attack, resulting in destructive actions. And so the final comment on the illustration is, so what we have here on the graphic is a well-meaning follower of Jesus, motivated, or misspelled word, motivated by what he thinks is righteous, inflicts damage on another, a perceived enemy. And where I view that the danger is where I feel I need to protect. And when I need to protect, I will define it how I see it. And there may be some truth in there, and there may be some error in there. Table time. So, what time is it? It is, I can't even see my clock. Oh, God, we got a half an hour. So, I thought it would be fun to look at the graphic and for us to articulate what is in what's going through Peter's head. The verse right after this is going to put a commentary on what Jesus thought of Peter's action, which was not very high. Here, Peter, in a well-meaning action, thinks he's really doing Jesus service, but he's not doing Jesus service at all. He's just causing destruction and damage. And I think it'd be really good to talk about what's in Peter's head. What's he thinking? And what phrase, would you put in the bubble? And maybe we could share stories of how we've seen this type of action. And I'm okay with the opposite too, where you've seen someone who has been mistreated, especially, guys, we're talking about the context of our Christian belief, the church, how you've seen this type of action from within your own experience. And like I said, or introduced, I'd be okay with a time when you felt you restrained from lashing out and took a different posture. I know Dave Brown has a wonderful story about this, but anyway, let's open it up. And again, I'm flying a bit blind here, so why don't you guys speak up at will and let's talk about this. And we've got about 25 or 30 minutes, so go ahead.
Carl, it looks like you're talking and you've got your audio off.
Thanks, Steve.
Jesus mentioned to his disciples that he was going to be taken and judged and crucified earlier on in the I can't put my fingers on the verse right now, but that was there in Peter's mind, in the back of his mind. Oh, this is it. And he didn't want that to happen. The disciples were shocked when Jesus told them that was what was going to happen, and now it's happening. So his response, I think, was kind of natural, you said this was going to happen, and now it's happening. So I have the power to stop it. So he drew his sword and started to try to stop the situation.
Yeah, good insight, Carl, and thank you. That is true, that they had the information, but I think what you're saying is Peter rejected that information. In other words, Jesus said it's going to happen, but somehow that prompted something in Peter to stop it. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, and he thought he could, because it's kind of like what we've got going on in our society today with guns.
Yeah, it's very much.
There's a lot of fear going on, and people think if they have a gun, they can solve the situation. The gun is the answer to solving the situation.
Yeah.
And so, we arm up. I think our society is armed up pretty high level. We see all these shootings that are going on, and what in the world's going on? It was never like this 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even.
Right. That you hit it right on the head as far as an application of this. That's exactly right. So anyway, any other, Carl, thanks for leading out. That was really, really good. And other guys, what do you think?
Yeah, Mike, I think Peter's actions were a reaction and not a response, not a well thought out response to what was going on. It was a reaction. And I think, like Carl was saying, it went back to the discourse in the upper room, because Jesus had told Peter, you're going to betray me, or you're going to deny me 3 times. And I think in the back of Peter's mind was, I got to show Jesus that I'm not going to deny him, but I'm going to defend him. So that was kind of in the back of his mind. And so his reaction to this hostile crowd coming towards Jesus was one of, I have to show Jesus that I'm on his side, that he's not right when he says I'm going to deny him. So I'm going to step forward and show him, and I'm going to defend him with this sword that I brought with me.
That's good. Again, another really good comment and insightful, Jeff. I got a question for you, and again, we want to allow the time for the other guys. Where did Peter go wrong?
Well, and I think I have to think of my own actions and reactions to when I feel like somebody is attacking Christ or attacking my belief in Christ, is my response is to fight back, and I have to defend Christ.
Right.
And
that's exactly right.
We talked about that earlier, how Christ does not need defending. I mean, God has said, I have cattle on 1,000 hills, and all that. He doesn't need anything from us. What he wants from us is obedience and a life that shows that, and this is Paul's words, but I am not ashamed of the gospel, and so many times I take that, I don't want to be ashamed of the gospel, to mean I need to defend vehemently my beliefs.
Right.
I need to attack those that are attacking me. Christ doesn't need my defense. Christ said in 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give an answer to those that ask you about it, about the hope that's in you, but do it with gentleness, reverence. Don't bring a sword. Bring hope to somebody else by being gentle toward them.
That's really, again, Jeff, you do such a good job on that. That is so true. Um, man, I'd love to hear more about that. I'm going to throw a question out to think about, but I don't want to redirect the discussion. I'd like to hear the comments from everybody. But what causes us to you have named the situation very well, that when someone apparently attacks Jesus or me, in this case, Jesus, he's protecting Jesus, the need to stand up against and verbalize and say, no, we're gonna put you in your place and name you whatever we name you, an enemy. And I'm doing that for the sake of righteousness. You have made it so clear. Jesus does not need that. We think he needs that, but we don't. And that is what leads to destruction. Anyway, I didn't mean to get into preaching here. Comments, fellas. Let's hear from you guys. Thanks, Jeff.
It's interesting, that I'll call it the ends that Jesus seeks is the establishment of his kingdom. And in a sense, it has to be established by his means as well. And his means, in this case, it does not require a sword.
Right. Yeah, that's really true.
And I think we oftentimes lose sight of that the ends of Jesus, which we want to support and help to bring about, need to be accomplished by the means of Jesus.
Yeah.
I was thinking here, your illustration just sort of prompted me. Malchus, as a servant, probably had very little power, so to speak, politically. He had very little power in this situation. But he suffered from this. And when we don't use the means of Jesus, there's collateral damage.
Yeah. Yeah, well said.
Yeah. It's something to think about. It affects others that may not be directly involved.
Yeah, Steve, another really good insight. Malchus was just there doing his job. He had no power. And, it doesn't say he's armed. They didn't get into a into a sword fight.
No.
Peter just lashed out, said, there's an ear, I'll cut that one off. And that's what collateral damage. That is so in the name of God, in the name of, and that's what's sad. It's really sad. So, Steve, again, another really good comment following the other guys. So, other thoughts, fellows?
I suppose if he would have done more than cut his ear off, if he would have killed him, Jesus probably would have brought him back from the dead.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. And of course, Carl, with that, referring to Steve's comment, the means in the other gospel, Luke, I think it's Luke, the means is healing, the means of restoration. Jesus repairs what his follower has done, and that's still true. Jesus can repair. Jesus is the repairer of all things. Whether he would have killed him, I think another point of what you brought out, Carl, is that, Jesus said in the next verse, put the sword away, Peter. Put the sword away. And I think that is not only to protect Malchus and the others, but also to protect Peter. Again, the extension of the grace of God in the situation.
I'd like to make a comment. For some reason, this particular illustration brought me back to thinking about when I was fired in Maine. And I've always thought that, it was, and even the president of the company afterwards admitted to me that it was a wrong thing that there was an advertising man who was interrupting a regulatory meeting in which we were deciding to license the product that he wanted to get on the market. Okay, so what I think back to that is what my blame was, and it relates to something that my wife always tells me. She says to me, "It's not what you say, it's how you say it."
Huh.
Okay, so now this actually brought to me is uh, what was my part in having this guy bring the sword, to get me fired, kind of thing. And it was probably how I said it in terms of perhaps preaching to him that, it's going to take time. This is a process. So it was something about how I said it. I could have tempered it more by saying, well, past things that shown us that it will take time. So, I have to warn you, it may take time just because of the regulatory process of the USDA. But anyway, I just thought about how, you know, in a sense, I brought a sword to this guy and introducing fear into him, and as a result, he went back and brought the sword to me. But I never thought of that about my part in it, and it was how
Huh.
I said it. Okay.
Wow. Well, man, Tatsi, thank you. If I understand what you're saying, you've mentioned this firing a lot of times, but I've never heard it from this perspective. It sounds like, Tatsi, you're analyzing your own piece in this whole thing, suggesting that you drew the sword first. And when you drew the sword, it caused the other person to draw the sword. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, thank you so much for sharing that. That is so common. I've done it numerous times. So thank you. Vince, I see you on the screen.
I coughed, but as long as I'm on the screen,
All right. I'm gonna go, man.
I've I've often thought that what Peter did was, he has the pseudonym of, impetuous Peter. He's always, can never quite tell what he's about to do. But I always thought what he did was perfectly reasonable. He's a hands-on guy. He's a fisherman, presumably working with the elements like he does the ocean and such, dragging nets. I mean, he's not a scholar, he's not the Matthew character. He's a hands-on kind of guy, and he's got his, I don't know if the sword is the equivalent of what we would have a pocket knife. I don't know if he always carries the sword or if he brought it specific. I don't know, but he had one, evidently.
Yeah.
And his friend was going to be captured and taken away to die. I think it's reasonable to try to stop it. We after the fact, tend to come up with, well, Jesus said this is not the time for the. Yeah, I know Jesus said a lot of stuff. But in the meantime, they're dragging my friend away, and I got a sword, and I'm stopping them. I'm not going to let this happen.
Yeah.
And we hear it in contemporary culture of, people. You brought up politics. I'll feed into that. People are like, well, these are precious children of God who deserve respect. Yeah, it's true. But right now he's choking my baby.
Yeah.
and I'm going to stop it and we'll deal with it later. I mean, you've got people dealing with reality that's right in their face, 2 feet away from them. And to say that the right action is to contemplate what did Jesus say when you have the answer in your hand right now.
Yeah.
I think what Peter did was perfectly reasonable. I probably would have done the same thing. I would have gotten the same chastisement that Peter got, from
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But to think that Peter was wrong and something flawed in his character, I don't think
Yeah.
so.
I
I think it was a rational, reasonable thing for it to do. Somebody breaks into your house, you don't question the moral, the intrinsic worth of the perpetrator. You defend your
yeah.
house,
Right.
and even though Peter knew that Jesus was going to be captured and that Malchus was a slave and he had no authority. Well, that's the Nuremberg defense. I'm just doing my job. Yeah, your job is to kill my friend. That's not going to happen.
So yeah. Vince, thank you again for your insight on that. I called it earlier an act of madness, which I still hold to, but that is not to be interpreted from arm's length. Oh, Peter really is deranged here. No, I'm just like Peter. I've done this numerous times. And what caused me to do that at the moment is the heat of the moment. Of course, I'm going to act out of what I think is the right thing to do. The unfortunate thing in the whole deal is what Jesus is going to say in the next verse. But I can identify exactly with Peter. I've done it numerous times in people, against people, and it's always caused damage. I can't say there's ever been a good result from my own experience. So, thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. That twist in there is really important.
One thing I think, Mike, too, is that Peter and the apostles have, not with a sword, but at other times it's described in scripture where a hostile crowd came at Jesus. Some wanted to throw him off a cliff, some wanted to stone him, whatever, and they got in the way. If you believe the chosen and how they depict it, his disciples, his apostles, got in between the crowd and Jesus walked away or slipped through the crowd, or however it's described, a number of different times. Now, the severity with which Peter does this is different. What I think Peter has kind of not taken into account in this is that all the other times Jesus has said, "It's not my time." And this time he has already said, "It is my time." He told them in the upper room, "That is,
my time.
It is my time. My time has come."
Yeah.
And he said it there in the garden as well. And I don't think that registered with Peter. And he was doing what he had always done and stepped in between Jesus and the hostile crowd. Now, again, the severity with which he did it this time was different. But it also could have been the fact that he realized that this was the time. These guys are really coming to arrest Jesus, and Jesus was going to allow that to happen. And quite frankly, Peter didn't want it to happen. So he did what he always did, and he stepped in defense of his teacher, his pastor, his savior. But he did it with a little too much fervor this time.
So, Mike, it'll be interesting how the chosen portrays this new season that's coming up that'll be available in June. I think streaming was in the movie theaters, but The Last Supper is the new season, and it ends right at this juncture. So we don't have their portrayal. But do you remember when the disciples and Jesus, before he goes to heal Lazarus, what the chosen does with that, right? So it's a couple months before all of this. I'm not sure, let's say 3-6 months before this. And at the chosen, the disciples are gone. We're going where? We're going to go see Lazarus, and Thomas, I think, well, let's go. We might as well all die. So they know they're walking into the hornet's nest. But I think some of us are lovers and some of us are fighters. And if you were going to be in a fight, you'd pick Peter rather than John or some of these other guys, right? Peter was kind of no nonsense. And I don't know, I'm kind of looking around to decide who's been in the military or not. I think Jeff's probably been through basic training and so forth. But if you're going to be in a fight, and you know how they always say, you can fire if you're fired upon. Well, that's a great idea, right? If somebody's got a gun, you're going to wait till they shoot at you first? Like, really? I mean, okay, I get it. But that if you're going to be in a fight and it's imminent, you're going to strike first. And Peter wasn't swinging for this guy's ear. It was dark, and he was playing for keeps. He's thinking, we're going to die. This is it. I'm going for this. So we portray this, and I see where you're going, Mike. The moral to the story, but somebody breaks in my house and is going to harm my wife or my kids, I'm playing for keeps. And it's kind of like having a gun or not having a gun. Well, that's a great idea. But if you're going to have a gun, my next question is, will you use it? Right? And do you have the wherewithal to play for keeps? So we got this character, Peter, and he's playing for keeps. Right? And how the chosen portrays him is he's doing what he does. He's reacting. He's not thinking. He's just, I'm going to protect and let's get out of here, and this Malchus just happened to be in front of him. But the moral to the story is, in our faith journey, how do we've got this far, and have we been trying to play a role that we're not supposed to in terms of defending the truth or whatever? Mike, you've often talked about this binary thing. It's either this or it's this. It's either, this or this. And we forget that sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that, right? The early church, Peter and James and Paul, these guys, they didn't know. It wasn't always copacetic. They were arguing, and it was not always what we would portray as these nice, loving guys sitting down singing Kumbaya, right? They were tough, hard people. Paul talks about, we live in this warfare, right? So if we saw the world as maybe the first century Jew and people, this spiritual warfare thing, there's that whole thing going on, right? That we're to take up these, armor, right? And get in the battle. And yet inside of all that, where we're called today in our journey, right, is Jesus is calling us to something different and beyond, I think. I think I can still protect my family, and I think there's still reason he'll say, go take a sword with you. I mean, Jesus has these comments like the first time he sends them out, don't take sword, don't take money, sandals, nothing. And the next time he sends them out, yeah, there'll come a time where you're going to need to take a sword with you, and that doesn't compute either. But the big picture is Jesus is calling us to a new way of life, I think. And it's not to fight necessarily with each other about me being right, you being wrong, and playing for keeps. And that's why we got all these different denominations, right? Because
Right.
each one's playing for keeps. There's something bigger that he's called us to, this transformation, which has to do with God's love, back to where we started with Steve's song, right? The Father's love, and there's something bigger going on. So yeah. So the moral to the story seems to be back to kind of what you're alluding to, Mike. We spent so much of our life fighting and wanting to be right, and
Yeah, yeah.
right, that we've kind of missed the point. There'll still be parts of life that you may have to physically be, but the heart of this thing is different.
Well said, John, along with the other comments. As I was driving this week through the sandhills of Nebraska, I had a lot of time of quietness, reflection, and I kept going back, where in my little graphic where I have the little arrows, where did Simon Peter go south? Because the judgment that's going to happen in 11, Jesus's judgment upon his action is going to be really apparent. It wasn't a good idea, Peter. I landed on this, and not everyone will land on this, but this is what I landed on. I said, if I bring a sword, I will tend to use the sword. I will use the sword. And the reason is because if I turn to a sword, whatever that sword is, this is a metaphor. If I turn to the sword of being right, is what you brought out, I will tend to use that, and it will cause destruction. That's where I've landed on it. I just think if Peter wouldn't have had the sword, we wouldn't have had the incident. He chose to bring the sword. And why do I choose to bring a sword? Okay, this is where it's going. Because I think I need to protect Jesus. And that's where we go wrong. That is really, does the creator of all creation, the cosmos, the subatomic world, does he need protection? Absolutely not. So how do I function? By faith in him, not to protect him. Wow, this is so apparent and so applicable to where we are living in our society right now in numerous ways, if we could dwell on that. So fellas, thank you for coming in. We made it. We got one more comment as a summary. Any thoughts?
Well, you could overlay it, and I don't have a thought, maybe somebody else does. You could overlay it with Martin Luther King. Like, why was the civil rights movement, why was his response to that? Why did God honor that, I guess? I mean, but the point is he was nonviolent in the face of violence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's really true.
I mean, that's just a little bigger picture of this.
You pointed, John, to the bigger picture. The ending of Dr. Martin Luther King was a disaster. And sometimes it ends like that. But in the real picture of things, in the real picture, in what Jesus calls the kingdom that is true and real and is here and will be as well, it's no disaster at all.
I do have another thought, Mike, too. We are, I think, called in defense of the gospel. And too many times I say to myself, well, the best defense is a good offense. So I'm the one that ends up attacking somebody. And what's their response to an attack? Their response is to defend themselves. They're not
Right.
hearing what I'm saying. They
No.
are defending their own beliefs.
Right.
And so they're not even hearing what I'm having to say. If I don't come with an attack towards somebody, then there's no battle, there's no fight.
Right.
So I feel like too many times I've been on the offense when I need to listen to what is being said from the other side, and
Yeah.
in defense of the gospel, come at them with gentleness and reverence and expressing the hope that is in me, like it says in Philippians, or in Peter, I guess it was.
Good,
So,
good final point.
yeah.
Good final point, Jeff.
The,
Fellas,
the
we made it through. I'm assuming I can record this and all that, but we made it, and we'll meet next week. I'll be back home next week, and we'll move on to verse 11, Jesus's response. And we're going to do a little more of a deep dive into the, what's under the hood here, and hopefully it'll bring insight into our own experiences and our own lives. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week, fellas. Thanks for joining. We'll see you. Bye for now.
Thank you, Mike. So long.
Bye.
Have a good day, Mike.
Where are you
Yeah,
at?
thank you.
Where are you at this morning, Mike?
I'm in Deadwood, South Dakota with my niece and brother, and we're headed to Colorado.
Oh,
We're
okay.
going to stay here another night, but we're going to go down there, come home tomorrow. So
Good for you. Had some time with your family.
thanks, Carl. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.